In the lightweight, very soft compound tired Tyrrell.
Oh Murray, you didn't know just how right you were. The 1984 San Marino Grand Prix saw Nelson Piquet start from pole position ahead of championship leader Alain Prost, who was a very satisfying 0.111 of a second back in qualifying from the reigning world champion. Third was Keke Rosberg and fourth was Derek Warwick, who was actually second in the world championship standings, following on from 2 consecutive podiums. Eventual world champion Niki Lauda could only manage 5th on the grid, alongside Rene Arnoux' Ferrari. As for the other Ferrari of Michele Alboreto, he could only manage 13th on the grid, just 1 race after a win in Belgium, and Nigel Mansell also struggled as he qualified 18th for Lotus. The biggest shock to the eyes of a modern F1 fan is that Ayrton Senna actually failed to qualify for this race, for the only time in his career. During the first session on Friday, the Toleman team were unable to run due to a disagreement with Pirelli, leaving them with no tyres, and then on Saturday, Senna's engine developed a misfire and he was 13 whole seconds off the pace. The Brazilian was Brazili out. When the race got underway, Niki Lauda didn't, and neither did Keke Rosberg after initially getting the launch. Luckily everyone avoided a square-on hit, and thank goodness for that, seeing as the crumple zones of these 1980s F1 cars were the driver's legs. Up in front, Piquet and Prost went side by side into turn 1, and Prost took the lead, a very daunting sign when you consider the might of that McLaren. Warwick then took a look at Piquet for second, but had to slot in behind as they reached the hairpin at Tosa. Then there was drama as a fast-starting Patrick Tambay collided with Eddie Cheever, kicking off today's crunch count and retiring from the race. Cheever himself was forced to pit with a rear left puncture. There was also apparently a retirement for Francois Hainaut, who you can see here by the side of the track, and Wikipedia lists it as a collision, so I guess I will too. I don't know really. My best guess is that he got caught out by the pack bunching up when Rosberg and Lauda stalled. At the end of the first lap, the order was Prost, Piquet, Warwick, Arnoux, and Manfred Winkelhock, who is impressively up to 5th in the ATS. You can't stop the Winkel Rock. One driver who very much could be stopped was Nigel Mansell, who spun off on the 3rd lap. This was Nigel's 5th non-classified result in a row, but he would break his drought with a 3rd place at the next Grand Prix. Also out of the race was Keke Rosberg, who had completed 2 laps after his stall, but then retired with electrical issues. 4 cars down already, but this is just the start of it. Trust me, attrition will be the word of the day here. And there's Riccardo Patrese, proving my point. Womp womp. Looking back to Arnoux in 4th, he'd been joined by his teammate Alboreto, who had dispatched of Winkelhock, and the 2 Ferraris were running together in front of their adoring crowd. Despite being called the San Marino Grand Prix, Imola is actually located in Italy, about an hour's drive away from San Marino, in the town of Imola, funnily enough. The Tifosi are always out in force here, and Ferrari always aim to give them a good show, or in this case, as good a show as they can muster against the might of McLaren. Just as would have been expected, Niki Lauda was carving his way through the field after his stall, and before long he was in the points and on the back of the Ferraris. Just look at the speed difference here as he pulls up alongside Alboreto through the Villeneuve corner and down towards Tosa, where he has to slot in behind the Ferrari driver. Lauda then had another go up the hill after Tosa, where he got through despite squeezing the Ferrari and getting close to contact. Just 1 lap later he was past Arnoux as well. Easy peasy, tifosi displeasy. Not long after getting 4th, the battle for 3rd heated up as Warwick and Lauda caught 2 battling backmarkers. That's Jonathan Palmer in the Tyrrell battling with Joe Gardner in the Acela, in the latter driver's first race in F1. This was actually the first time that Acela had entered 2 cars in 1984, thus allowing Joe to make his debut, and he ironically bumped his teammate Ginzani from the field by out-qualifying him by 2 whole seconds. Joe was an underrated driver who ended up only doing this season of F1, despite scoring a 5th place finish at the Italian Grand Prix. He eventually died in an accident in 1986 at the age of just 32. Rest in peace, man. Oh, and talking of gone too soon, the engine of Niki Lauda's McLaren gave way on lap 16 and took him out of the race. A promising drive came to an end right as he was about to pass Warwick and get onto the podium places. This was Lauda's 3rd retirement in the first 4 races of the season, putting him well down in the championship standings. Oh well, at least he would come back in style after this, winning the next race in France and lapping Prost on his home soil. The closest championship fight in history was far from over, despite how it seemed. There was further drama a few laps later as Prost had a big spin. Apparently the McLaren had struggled throughout practice with an intermittent electrical issue which caused the engine to glitch out and lock the rear tyres, and it looked like it was happening again. The good news for Prost is that it was an intermittent issue rather than a permanent one, so he could continue on in the race, but the bad news was that he had absolutely no way to predict if or when this issue would happen again. Prost still led the race, but it was all change behind him as Warwick had caught and passed Piquet off screen for second place, and Arnoux had made a pit stop for new tyres. Also in the pits was Michele Alboreto in the other Ferrari, with the difference being that this was a retirement. Oh dear. Alboreto had been in serious contention for a podium on this day, but Ferrari will do Ferrari things. This now put Teo Fabi up into 4th place in the second Brabham, and René Arnoux back up to 5th after his pit stop. Back to the fight for second, here's Piquet getting easily back past Warwick up the hill, which makes me wonder why Warwick was ahead of him in the first place, since Piquet is clearly faster and had a decent gap last time we saw him. There's a real chance that Piquet had a spin or a pit stop or something like that off screen, but it's very hard to tell. That's the problem with watching old broadcasts from the 1980s. If you don't see something happening with your own eyes, the best you can do sometimes is guess. I know we all like to make fun of modern TV direction for its cringy graphics and its overuse of crowd shots, but at least it actually tells the story of the race somewhat. Now, as if on cue, we're going to watch an empty track for a bit, and then glitch and die apparently. Jolly good. I think what the camera was trying to find was this scrap between Fabi and Arnoux for 4th place, as Arnoux struggled to get through despite his fresher tyres. That Brabham was incredibly fast on the straights, being one of the most powerful F1 cars ever made up until then, and that made it extremely difficult to overtake, much to the frustration of Arnoux. Here he is having another go, and oh, that's close, putting a wheel right onto the grass. Eventually, he did get through, using the slipstream to pass through Villeneuve. The Tifosi waved their appreciation, but they still had almost no hope of a Ferrari victory. By this point, Prost was so far in the lead that he'd actually made a pit stop and still come out over 10 seconds clear of the opposition. Oh, and that's the Sol ATS of Manfred Winkelhock retiring from the race on lap 32. I guess while you can't stop the Winkelrock, a turbo failure certainly can. Manfred had been doing an excellent job up until this point from a fantastic 7th place qualifying position, and this retirement was his 4th in a row. I'll tell you what, any man would be pretty fed up with that. Back to Arnoux's charge through the field, here he is taking 3rd place from Derek Warwick, who was trying to do the whole race without pitting. René's next target was Nelson Piquet, just a few seconds up the road. By the way, look who's up to 6th place on the timing screen. Not only had Andrea de Cesaris miraculously not retired yet, but he was actually on course for a point despite having to start from the back of the grid due to technical issues causing him to miss the cutoff for getting to his rightful starting place. That would have been 12th place rather than 26th. That order was about to change though, as out of the race went both Brabhams! That's Piquet you're seeing, but Teo Fabi's car was expiring at exactly the same time as the turbos on their BMW engines remembered what era it was. This now put Arnoux up to 2nd and de Cesaris up to 3rd, who had inexplicably passed Derek Warwick. Incredible stuff from the back of the grid, although I don't know how Derek seemingly lost 30 seconds in just 9 laps. Unfortunately, also out of the race by this point were Jacques Lafitte, Mark Schurrer and Joe Gardner in his F1 debut, and this meant that only 13 cars remained, with only 5 of those being on the lead lap. As for Warwick, look who's ahead of him now! That's Elio De Angelis from 11th place on the grid, showing just how much the Renault driver was struggling all of a sudden. At this rate, he was in danger of dropping off the lead lap as De Angelis chased de Cesaris for an unexpected podium. Oh, never mind. With the checkered flag in sight, de Cesaris pulled off the road, apparently out of fuel. He wasn't the only one though. Martin Brundle pulled off on the left there at almost the same time, although we know now that he would have been disqualified anyway due to Tyrrell's illegal ballast. All of a sudden they were dropping like flies within sight of the line. Johnny Cicotto went off, Philippe Alliot retired with turbo failure, and various other cars began to cough and splutter as they ran dangerously low on fuel. At the end of the day though, Alain Prost came home to win the San Marino Grand Prix and extend his championship lead to 11 points. 2nd place was Arnoux, 13 seconds back, and coming home in 3rd place was absolutely no one. Allow me to explain. Third place would have been Elio De Angelis, but he actually ran out of fuel on the last lap and failed to make it to the line. However, Derek Warwick was put a lap down just before the finish, and so De Angelis was classified third simply by starting the last lap. Amazingly, a very similar thing happened just 1 year later at the same Grand Prix, when a whole host of cars misjudged their fuel and ran out, ironically giving De Angelis the win on that occasion. Back to 1984, Warwick was classified 4th, but he would have been on the podium if he just managed to hold on to the lead lap and stop Prost from lapping him. Stefan Bellof was initially 5th for Tyrrell, but he would also be disqualified from the results several months later for the same reason as Brundle. Maybe one day I'll do a video about the 1984 Tyrrell controversy, but in all honesty there are enough videos explaining it already, so if you're interested then please do look it up. Thierry Boutsen was eventually given 5th for Arrows, and amazingly Andrea De Cesaris was 6th despite having run out of fuel. Eddie Cheever was 7th in his Alfa Romeo, but he also ran out of fuel because apparently no one can calculate fuel mileage at Imola. Also classified as finishers were Mauro Baldi and Jonathan Palmer, but that's it. Just 9 classified finishers, and only 6 of those actually crossed the finish line. What an absolutely brutal race, and what a ridiculous finish it had. Guys, before I give this race a score, I want to let you know that I have a Daily Motion channel where I upload all the videos that get taken down from YouTube by the pesky FOM bots. While I accept that FOM owns the rights to the race footage I use, I believe that all of my videos fall under fair use due to the high levels of parody, commentary and review, and I always encourage people to watch Formula 1 live in order to better appreciate this great sport. Sadly, this isn't always enough. I also occasionally stream on Twitch, where you can chat to me live, so I've included the links to both my Daily Motion and my Twitch channel in the description of this video. Thank you. I gave the Grand Prix a 6 out of 10 overall, because even though it was highly entertaining and unpredictable, it hasn't left as much of a mark on the history of F1 as some other races of attrition from the 1980s. I also struggled to decide how I should score the race in terms of championship implications, because at the time I think it would have seemed like Prost had it all but sewn up, when we now know that Lauda was about to launch an incredible comeback and steal the championship by just half a point. It did have some merit as far as the championship was concerned, because the retirements of Alboreto, Lauda and Rosberg allowed Arnoux and De Angelis to take joint 3rd place in the standings. I'll give the Driver of the Day award for Best Driver to Andrea De Cesaris for once, because even though he failed to make it to the line, he still made it far enough to give Ligier a very valuable point from the very back of the grid. As well as this, he would absolutely have been on course for a podium had his team actually put enough fuel in the car. Honourable mentions go to Elio De Angelis for finishing 3rd despite running out of fuel, Thierry Boutsen for getting P5 with an outdated Ford engine, and Stefan Bellof who drove excellently and then got disqualified through no fault of his own. I'll give the Inouye trophy for Worst Driver to Philippe Alliot, who was slow like always and continuously got in the way of the leaders. Drive safely guys, and I'll see you next time.